Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this first session. I'm Billy Melman of the History Department, and I'm grateful to Moti and Ranan for asking me to take over this particular session. Now, a couple of days ago, I met two of my brightest graduates, and they asked me, rather self-assuredly and sneeringly, so will you not be rethinking or revisiting ethnicity and nationalism? And I said I was hoping so. And they said, and you could see them imagining other, greener fields and topics for discussion, then say, so will you be saying that the studies of, or that discussion of nationalism is having a second coming now? What possibly can you say about a topic that wasn't said before? They had in mind, of course, the rather moving William Butler Yeats poem of the post-Easter 1916 revolution in Ireland, in his whole series of nationalist poetry, which treated the rebellion and what happened later. I modestly said that, well, you know, some people are even talking today about nationalism third coming, as a fact, as a notion, and as a topic. And I was aiming, of course, at Tom Nairon's article under that name, which I think Paul published in his Arena Studies, about nationalism's third coming at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, the session that we are having now will rather take the broader sweep, and will start tying together issues like globalization, globalism, and the local community and the state, and the particular roles of the state within national movements, thought, and violence. It is a particular pleasure for me to be able to introduce Hedva Ben Israel, who was not my teacher, but from whom I learned quite a lot. We collaborated on various projects, and I always love to discuss with her what I'm doing in my research. Hedva is Professor Emerita of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and she is holder of the Ben Eliezer Chair on the Study of Nationalism. She completed her MA at the Hebrew University, and she received her PhD from Cambridge University. Her book on the English historians of the French Revolution is still irreplaceable. It was written in 1968. There hasn't been any real substitute for this particular text, and it was reissued by Cambridge in 2002. She also authored In the Name of the Nation, Studies in Nationalism and Zionism, which appeared in 2004 and which I'm holding now, and also numerous articles on nationalism, on the two world wars, on politics and culture, and quite a bit on historiography. She currently co-writes the prestigious History of the Hebrew University, which is a multidisciplinary project which has been going on for quite a while now. And I welcome you, Hedva. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm very grateful indeed. In fact, I'm deeply moved by all of these greetings that I'm fortunate to receive. and I'm very grateful to have been asked to give this opening lecture, which will be the lecture of a historian and rather general. In Europe, they say that the US and Israel are the only nationalist states in an enlightened world which has shaken off nationalism, opened borders, given up sovereignty, etc. This is not the case. The nation state, that is, a state with a cultural identity, is not disappearing, though it has changed. It is the changing perspectives of nationalism which are my main topic this afternoon. For more than 200 years, philosophers, poets, politicians, and scholars have praised or dismissed the principle of nationalism. The accumulation of knowledge has not narrowed the margin of disagreement. The terminology is now more sophisticated, but the debates on what is nationalism, when and why did it come into being, how natural and how durable is it, reveal an endless array of contradictory interpretations. One conclusion, therefore, that I shall be leading to is that the variety of phenomena that go under the metaphor nationalism cannot possibly be explained by one comprehensive theory. To lump together the strivings of ethnic groups for political expression with imperial expansion or decolonization or racial hatreds or border skirmishes or ethnic cleansing or economic exploitation does not make historical sense. It is time to deconstruct the theoretic edifices and test them against history. Another conclusion is that it is no longer relevant or fair to conduct the debate about nationalism in terms of the classical ideology of nationalism as developed by 19th century writers. Even those who argue that the nation-state is a form of political organization which has stood the test of time and is likely to remain so, do not think of it in the old mystical way as an embodiment of an eternal national soul or as the most meaningful dimension of our lives. Not many today believe that humanity has always been divided into mutually exclusive nations, each with its race, place, and the certainty of being superior. The age of romanticism and ideology is over. Modern states are mixed, and people have several identities. National identity is not a sealed chest of treasures inherited and passed on intact, but a multifaceted product of socialization tempered by free choice. Not only has the attitude to the nation changed, but the interest in nationalism has continuously reflected the impact of world events. Leaving aside the 19th century, when nationalism became a central force, changing history and being changed by it, in the 20th century too, the understanding of nationalism was shaped by environmental causes as much as by internal developments. The First World War brought out the centrality of nationalism in the causes and consequences of the war. The peace settlements were partly shaped by a declared belief in national self-determination as a basic principle for building a new world. Some of the problems to which the peace settlements gave rise were the result of the different meanings attributed to the concept of the nation by the different political cultures represented. While the Central and East European ethnic groups were striving for nation-states to express their particular ethnic identities, the Anglo-Saxon powers supporting them were expecting that new nations would be forged within the new state borders. Czechs, Slovaks, Germans and Hungarians within the Czechoslovakia borders would form a new nation. After the war, when the systematic study of nationalism began, the pioneers in this field tried to explain the discrepancies. From the writings of nationalists, they tried to formulate typologies and value judgments, why certain nationalisms are good and others bad. Their explanation was national culture. The ruling notion in those early studies, until about the middle of the 20th century, was that nationalism is something that begins with an idea in someone's mind, then spreads and becomes a popular political movement. The Second World War was again seen as a climax of nationalism, but this time not as one of the principles guiding the construction of a just world, but as marking the deterioration of nationalism to the ultimate expression of collective evil. This happened in spite of the fact that the UN Charter again confirmed the right to national self-determination. But the bloody stains on nationalism affected the directions of scholarship. On the one hand, it strengthened the tendency to construct typologies and classify nationalisms as good or bad, rational or emotional, associational or organic, constructive or destructive, Western or Eastern. On the other hand, it gave rise to new schools which ignored the discredited ideology and focused on social and economic conditions as producing nation-states. The rejection of ideology led social scientists to look for alternative material grounds by which to explain nationalism. They firmly harnessed nationalism to rolling modernity. Urbanization, industrialization, communication, transportation, in their theories, not only explain nationalism, but should guide new nation and state building in the decolonizing world. The rejection of the ideology of nationalism increased in the 1960s with the New Left, and until about the 1980s, most writers treated nationalism as a relic of fascism in a world in which politics was seen as based either on individualism or on class, that is, on liberalism or Marxism. This attitude caused a reaction, the rise of the ethno-nationalist school, stressing the strength and invincibility of ethnicity on psychological and historical grounds. The claim of ethno-nationalists was not biological, that nations were extended families, but that human psychology tends to cherish inherited symbols and ethnic solidarity, whether real or mythical. The debate on whether nations spring out of ethnic, cultural, or social economic ground is still on. The upsurge of ethnic strife in the 1990s marked a turning point in favor of the ethno-nationalist school. More writers, free of the stereotypical shackles left behind by the totalitarian ideologies, reopened the discussion of nationalism, ostensibly free of prejudice. One line which gained ground from then on was the attempt to eliminate the dichotomic approach to nationalism and liberalism as incompatible. Another dichotomy, both defended and attacked, is that between identity and citizenship. Writers debate whether for equal citizenship, identity needs to be ignored. I shall come back to these central topics later. So far for the links between world events and the study of nationalism. My next point is on the onslaught of theories, and it is meant to bring out the variety and only partial validity of theories about nationalism. This was a huge survey of theories, but due to the shortage of time, I will just say that some theories explain nationalisms as natural product of history and some as a conspiracy of interested elites to fortify their power, some as a byproduct of modernity and mainly industrialization, and some as the influence of the translated Bible with its image of the ancient nation of Israel. There are hundreds of different theories, none of which fits all cases. The only pattern recurring in most cases is the combination of cultural identity and political power, which remains the minimal definition of nationalism. Having referred to the directions of studies and the multiplicity of theories, I should now like to draw attention to some of the present-day debates. One of the core issues is the survival or disappearance of ethnic groups. Here the concept of assimilation is, I think, crucial and somewhat neglected. Those who deny the continuity of nations naturally stress the role of assimilation, forced or voluntary, which in the past eliminated numerous ethnic groups which assimilated for economic or cultural benefits. But this view does not account for those individuals and groups who, against calculations of gain or loss, chose not to assimilate and became national activists. History shows that they were not all people who were rejected or hindered from assimilation. The point is that anti-nationalist modernist scholars see acculturation and assimilation as the normal, rational, and progressive choice, and they see the cultivation of separate identities as the choice of misfits. Hobsbawm on nationalism is the perfect example of the way scholarly conclusions, political preferences, and personal experience can go together. He expresses contempt for nationalism, denies its historical roots, attributes self-interest to its promoters, and regards the linguistic nationalism of ethnic groups as the reaction of those who cannot pass examinations. In his disdain for nationalism as a vicious invention, the Marxist Hobsbawm joins the ultra-conservative Keduri in the idea that nationalism was a vicious invention. Keduri attributes the invention to the feverish minds of uprooted German philosophers and Hobsbawm to scheming capitalist elites. It is interesting to note that Keduri and Hobsbawm, as well as Hans Kohn, Ernest Gellner, Karl Deutsch, were all migrant Jews who adopted new homelands and new cultures, had brilliant academic careers, and quite fittingly also developed theories which underrate the importance of given national or ethnic identities. Assimilation, the punching bag of all nationalists, from the German Arndt, the Irish Douglas Hyde, and our Achad Ha'am, was thus recycled as one of the key concepts of anti-nationalism. Assimilation is a central theme also for the opposite school. For example, the philologist Fishman, a declared primordialist and ethno-nationalist, believes that no one feels comfortable except in his mother tongue, and that it is the subjective feelings of cultural identity that determine national belonging. He argues against the constructivists, not just academically, but as representing political forces out to destroy the languages of small nations, force them to assimilate, lose their identity, their dignity, and their purpose in life, making the world a poorer place. The prominent scholar among ethno-nationalists, Anthony Smith, also believes that inherited symbols and rich cultures ensure continued nationalism. In his scholarly analysis, Smith occasionally lapses into a defensive tone. For instance, when he declares that nationalism is not irrational or mystical, but a rational search for freedom, for a place among nations, for saving national cultures from extinction and developing them freely in historical homelands. These examples for and against assimilation illustrate the political undercurrents in nationalism studies. The link with political views is also evident in one of the central debates about nationalism, which happens to be topical for us in this country. Is nationalism compatible with liberalism? The notion that nationalism is by definition a particularist principle singling out for membership a predetermined group marked and demarcated to the exclusion of all others is of course common and true. But it also raises the question if there is any other practical principle of political organization which is not bounded in some way. Also, theoretically, the principle of nationalism applies equally to all groups. The liberal defense of the nation-state is conducted partly in the spirit of John Stuart Mill, who saw state homogeneity as providing a suitable basis for liberal institutions. It is also said that the people's sovereignty is best fulfilled when the rulers are of the same identity, that the nation-state is the most suitable vehicle for the application of universal rights because it is able to combine principles with traditions and thus provide for all the needs of the citizens. The claim is that even universal rights to be realized need a contextual environment. In this debate about the compatibility of nationalism and liberalism, it seems to me that both sides are right. The potential for liberal or coercive nationalism is there just as it is in every other political principle, including democracy, if pushed to its logical conclusion. Nationalism has been notoriously abused. Historically, it began as a movement for liberation at the time of the French Revolution. Later, however, governments learned to mobilize nationalism as a tool for imperialism and fascism, as well as for decolonization. It became a force which could join other ideologies and take on their liberating or enslaving aims. Most writers tried to balance the norm of seeing all people as equal against the distinction embedded in the concept of nationalism between those who are in and those who are out. This circle cannot, I think, be squared on philosophical ground. A solution can only be sought in practical compromise. Purely logical solutions in states with minorities can only lead either to the fragmentation of states or to attempts to completely neutralize states. The attempt to iron out ethnic identities in favor of abstract citizenship, apart from being coercive, cannot be achieved because identities are inseparable from individual or collective existence. This takes me right to the heart of another contemporary debate, that of identity and citizenship. Some see them as opposites, and some as interdependent categories based on the claim that democratic states do not function by law or force alone, but need the support of consent, coherence, solidarity provided by the common identity. This raises the question of minorities, which is central. Most democratic states seek to accommodate their minorities. If we rule out oppression and fragmentation, then compromise is the only practical solution, and the degree of success is in proportion to the degree of democracy. In Europe, where states can be small and yet viable, secession has also proved a practical solution, as we have seen only a few days ago in Montenegro. But the rest of the world has not reached that stage yet. Secession, one should stress, is not a sign of the weakness of nationalism, but of its strength, just as it was when empires were broken up. National and ethnic groups still aspire for independence. Some are using violence, and others are negotiating for it. A similar debate, rising from the present reality of multiple identities in one state, is that on civic and ethnic forms of nationalism. These modern concepts really continue the old typologies separating selfish from egalitarian nationalism and are meant to convey a political message against racism and for equality. But the ideal of a purely neutral state has nowhere been realized. Minorities in France, the model civic state, do not fare better than in Germany, the ethnic state. Also, French citizenship is imbued with French cultural codes and tends to enforce uniformity to the extent of violating religious freedom. The Americans, too, require cultural tests for citizenship. The English express disdain for preoccupation with symbols of identity as irrational, but are not immune from it, as is shown in their defensiveness about the pound or the Constitution. Also, to present civic nationalism as voluntary association is misleading. Most people do not choose their citizenship, but are born to it. An American citizen remains one, even if he turns fascist. The Habermas idea of constitutional patriotism has been criticized on the ground that without the link to culture, the citizen's loyalty is not feasible. Those propagating the idea of civic nationalism want to save us from ethnocentrism, but the very distinction they make in favor of the Western political culture is an ethnic distinction and also a paternalistic one. Ethnic is not just the marginal and exotic. The political values of France, Britain, and the US are ethnic in that they reflect these countries' histories. The point I'm making is that there is a history-dependent national style, and citizenship itself is conditioned by the cultural context. I claim, therefore, that civic and ethnic nationalism, terms which are highly useful for theoretic analysis, do not really exist in pure form in any state. Every nationalism is a combination of both. Democratic countries recognize equality before the law, and in this sense they are civic. But they all have cultural profiles, and in that sense they are ethnic. Moreover, states which are openly identified as ethnic may well be more respectful to the cultural identity of minorities and their right, for example, to be educated in their language. My point is that ethnic identity and civic democracy are not alternatives, but complementary elements. The political entity, as well as the citizens, need the transparency of rationality and the familiarity of identity. Not one democratic state, not even in the European Union, has gone so far as to disclaim its language or abolish its Ministry of Education. No country has chosen anonymity instead of identity. Of course, the attempt to combine objective equality with subjective identity gains different degrees of success. What then is nationalism today? It is not an entity which keeps reappearing like drought or war, nor is it an ideology in the sense it was in the 19th century. Ideologies are universal schemes for a better world. Herder and Mazzini presented nationalism as a universal ideology. Nowadays, the only ideologies left are cosmopolitanism and some forms of socialism. The adherents of Europeanism or Islamic fundamentalism, however they may pose, are in fact pursuing their own interests, and nationalism too is no longer a cognitive value by which we interpret the world as a whole. We know that nations and states are mixed, that cultures and populations have always crossed borders, that migrations affect identities. Even when it was viewed as a universal ideology, nationalism never had a founding text. Every nationalist leader or writer made up his own nationalist testament. Without an authorized version, no general pattern exists. Today more than ever, movements choose their style. The title of the new nationalism is sometimes given to those modern and rich countries like Quebec or Catalonia or Scotland who are negotiating their separation in economic, administrative and constitutional terms. Others use the same title for the extreme national movements fired by religion. Nationalism is no longer an object for worship or for iconoclasm. It has been demystified but not discarded. Most modern people have a national identity without devotion to myths, symbols and traditions. They value the combination of a cultural identity, sober patriotism and international cooperation. They speak of we and they, invoking difference but not enmity. The civic and cultural functions of the nation-states are still essential for citizen rights as well as for a system of education which affords stability. Education open to haphazard cultural influences is not imaginable. Anderson and Smith say that it is the promise of collective immortality that has made nationalism so attractive. This may not be as valid today as it was in the past. Globalization. As Giddens points out, international organizations and ethnic movements sometimes strengthen each other. The spread of technology creates superficial uniformity, but also raises particularist consciousness and provides the means for strengthening it. Also, economic globalization, though it weakens the control of states over the economy, needs strong states in order to operate safely within them. Though there is increasing interference in the internal affairs of states, formal sovereignty still exists. Concentric loyalties are becoming common. A Scot can be loyal to his clan, to Scotland, to Britain, to Europe. When the Germans say, as they do, we have thrown nationalism overboard, they mean they have discarded aggressive nationalism, not their identity as Germans and Europeans. Nationalism is thinner. The concern for heritage has dwindled. National solidarity is demystified, but not dead. For individuals, national identity depends on history and education, but also on environment and choice. National identity is often transcended in intellectual and creative activities. These changes should also affect our method of studying nationalism. Previously, scholars searching for formulas aligned themselves in fortified camps, each ruled by one dominating theory, and they accused each other either of biological determinism or of social engineering. Debate seems more balanced now. You do not have to be a constructivist to realize that some nations are old and some are new and strategically created. You can turn to history to trace the evolutionary process by which linguistic groups solidified, and also accept the combination of material and political elements of modernity. Also accept that these elements often transformed populations into political nations. We can pay due attention to cultural or religious influences, such as the translations of the Bible, and also to economic transformations. We can do all this because history reveals numerous and profoundly different forms of nationalism. If scholars could give up treating nationalism as one organic entity whose DNA we need to decipher, we would realize that we are dealing with a variety of historical situations in which the slogan, "in the name of the nation," covers a multitude of realities. Thank you. Well, you can judge whether...
Mine fits into yours.
It does? Well, yeah, let's wait.
Yeah. Well, I think you'll immediately note a continuity, right? A kind of a flow between the two talks, which is very good as an opener to a conference. And I'm very happy and privileged to introduce Paul James, who is Professor of Globalism and Cultural Diversity at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology and Director of this institute's Globalism Institute, right? He's editor of the Arena Journal, which I mentioned earlier, and born too late, and I'm quoting, as he disarmingly says in his introduction to Global Matrix, which I'm holding now, and those of you who are sitting near here will notice, the famous Goya Colossus, the question being who the Colossus is, global economic powers or global terrorism, whatever. Now, as Paul himself disarmingly says, he was born too late to be a modernist, that is, modernist in discussing nationalism terms, and born too late to join the ranks of postmodernists, again in the jargon of discussion of nationalism. And this and his antipodium outlook or angle looking at nationalism with his work on places like Timor, Australia, etc., made for his original approach to nationalism and globalization. Now, this particular combination has resulted in numerous publications, including Nation Formation Toward a Theory of Abstract Community, which appeared in 1996 and won him the Crisp Medal, and Globalism, Nationalism and Tribalism, which appeared this year and which I'm holding now. Last year, he co-published with Tom Naren, Global Matrix, and he is now embarking on an impressive and quite intimidating 16-volume project, which shall probably be titled Central Currents in Globalization, and which he is co-authoring with several other people. And the first chunk of it, which basically is 4 volumes, will look mainly at historical roots of globalization and at current situation. And he shall now speak on beyond the myth of ethnic violence, configurations of localism, nationalism and globalism.
Thank you, Billy. It's very appropriate that we start with What Rough Beast, the Third Coming, because William Butler Yeats was speaking in a very different generation from ours. And to go back to that period is to evoke some of the hopes and aspirations of a time when people were trying to work out what they were going to do politically. And they were making their world, and they were discussing the problems and associated crises of that time. Well, the world we live in now, I think, is facing a whole new set of crises, and they face those crises in ways where we, for the most part, look at them melodramatically, look at them with new mythologizing eyes. We look at them in ways that remake the world over and over, and we tend still, at least in the mainstream, not to get at the truth. And I think just coming after the talk by Hedva Ben Israel, which was provocative and dynamic, I feel very privileged to actually talk second. And not just because if I talked first you might have taken apart everything I have to say, but because what I'm doing in some ways is really a footnote to what she did. I want to look at one aspect of what she was doing, and that is the question of ethnic nationalism and its contribution to violence in the world today. And I'm going to concentrate on trying to get beyond the myths of ethnic violence, and I want to talk about a new development which is called localized transnational violence. This localized transnational violence is a violence which is occurring around the world at the moment and is being picked up on many scholars. But within the mainstream, it's being blamed on a return to primordialism, a return to irrationalities, a clash of civilizations, the rise of jihad, the movement towards a kind of reclamation of the past, as if this atavistic past has come up to meet us again. And if you've got someone coming forward from that period when people were writing in the 80s out the end of nationalism, they'd be very embarrassed to face the world we face now, but they'd be making up new mythologies, I think, to try and explain it. And the talk is also within the spirit of a conversation I had with David Lurie before we came, where I was thinking about what Moti had done, what Moti Tumarkin had done in trying to think through what actually is happening around ethnic nationalism in the world today. And he, that is that challenging prospectus that you gave us, said ethnic nationalism is not the cause of violence. So putting that together with the conversation with David was to emphasise that to get at these truths is to start to get at thinking about an alternative world, to start to think about ways out of some of the present morass. So let's follow up by talking about, as Hedva did, about the cultural identity and political power as being the core of what we're actually here to talk about today, because across the turn of the 21st century, what we've seen is a myriad ethnic groups being spread across the world, and within and across national boundaries, and for whatever we can say about them, those groups have become central to world politics. And they've also linked in to an increasing incidence of violence. Now, the obvious conclusion to that has been that ethnicity causes the violence. In fact, you even go some way further than that. Some of the people are talking about the consequences of an ethnic revival, and it's so seeped into the common culture, and journalistic renditions of ethnic, religious, tribal violence are projected with such regularity that now what we see is the term ethnic conflict is now used to name the conflict itself. Now, it's a simple process. Just call it ethnic conflict, and then you think, well, ethnicity must cause it. If it is ethnic conflict, then the basis of it must be ethnic. It becomes a synonym for what I'm going to call localized transnational conflict. And it's too easy. What happens is the conflicts are routinely labelled as ethnic, religious or tribal, and then the source of them must be ethnic, religious, national or tribal. I want to argue that neither ethnicity nor diaspora identity politics per se are an abiding source of insecurity in the world today. In one sense, and I put this carefully, ethnicity, nationalism, diaspora politics are a locus of violence, but they're not a basis of violence. That is, what we're seeing today is that this ethnicity is being used alongside other terms it particularly becomes, and you can see how under other conditions, it quickly becomes the conditions of stress and sporadic violence, a local way of naming or attributing grievances, whether you're on the ground in East Timor, in other places around the world like Bosnia or Kosovo, and East Timor is a very peculiar example to see ethnicity being attributed to what is tribal differences there, where tribal differences make almost no difference to the violence, yet journalists somehow find it. It's often used instrumentally by contenders for state power to further tensions for other ends. So you can see it in Bosnia, where Milosevic, the late Slobodan Milosevic, used ethnic differences, particularly in a place like Kosovo, to protect what was a mythological claim to a past around Kosovo Polja and the 1389 revolution. It's often treated by peacekeeping and other interventionist forces as a foundational source of the violence and the easiest way of naming the protagonists. And so if you get various Rambouillet agreements and so on, they name the protagonist as ethnically different. And finally, in a self-confirming circle, it becomes one of the most prominent fault lines along which militarized conflicts are engaged. Well, many people have done different studies, and you can find little tiny moments where the recognition that ethnicity is not the source of that violence comes to the fore. I mentioned just one source, which is Klaus Gansel's work, not a particularly well-known one, where he's worked his way through all the crises and wars between 1945 and 1992, and he finds ethnicity is the basis of 3 of them. And even there, ethnicity, and I think this is what Hedva was pointing to, is one part of this violence rather than the naming of it, the source of it, the basis of it. So as James Clifford argues, while some of the most violent articulations of purity and racial exclusivism come from diaspora populations, such discourses are usually the weapons of the relatively weak. Whatever their ideologies of purity, diasporic cultural forms can never in practice be exclusively nationalist. They are deployed in transnational networks, built in from multiple attachments, and they encode practices as well as accommodation with, as well as resistance to, host countries and norms. You get the sense of the commonality of our 2 talks coming through. So what I'm going to try and do really is just unsettle that nexus between ethnicity and violence. And what it allows us to do is point away from ethnicity itself as this big generic thing and point away from it to the ways in which ethnicity gets at the micro level and national and regional level drawn upon by power elites and used for other ends, all the way to more structural explanations which give you more comprehensive ways of contextualizing the violence in the world today. So I'm going to make a series of arguments. There are actually 3 arguments in this talk. The first argument is the usual set of myths about the sources of militarized violence and the conflict in the world over the past few decades have mostly been unhelpful. They're mostly 3/4 wrong, and to the extent that they're a quarter right, gets you thinking, well, maybe they've got something going for them, but usually they're substantially misleading and lead into wrong sorts of practice. The second argument, that there's been a fundamental shift in the dominant form of militarized violence in the world, and a shift from interstate wars as the dominant form of the way in which we fought across boundaries to what is sometimes called intrastate wars, which leads to the false argument about the wars being inside a state, but what might be called transnationalized local violence. We're seeing a whole shift from interstate wars to something else. And the third argument is that the core issues of insecurity and violence, and this is effectively what we're arguing in both papers, needs to be understood in the context of the layering of local, regional, national, and global social relations. And if you can't stretch your analysis across all those levels, you're actually going to find yourself having a misunderstanding of why wars are fought and how they're fought. And just to use a very simple example from Kosovo, if you thought that the war in Kosovo was about a massacre at Ratchak and the possibility of cultural cleansing or ethnic cleansing, then you've missed out on 9/10 of that war. You've missed out on power politics, you've missed out on the global process of humanitarian intervention, the way it's changed. You've missed out on the changing nature of nationalism. You've missed out on the ways in which manipulation of genocide occurs from both sides. And you've missed out on the way in which the movement from Bosnia to Kosovo occurred in a context of a changing form of violence. So those three arguments are going to affect what I say about practice. And I won't have a lot of time to talk about practice, but what I want to keep putting back into the contention as I talk is that each of the times we talk, we should be thinking about what this means for what we do about it, what this means about what is to be done. So the first argument, I want to counter the myths about upheaval in the world today. And there are a lot of myths, and I won't get through very many of them. The first one is the ethnic nationalism hypothesis, and I'm simply echoing Hedva Ben Israel in what I'm saying here, because one of the claims is there is good or bad nationalism, but it doesn't say good or bad nationalism based upon the principles of how you enact your relationship to identity politics. It says good nationalism is civic and Western and abstract and generalised, whereas bad nationalism is primordial, organic, Eastern and mystical in its form. This whole thing means that when you talk about the current war on terror, there is an idea that somehow terrorism arises primarily out of ethnic nationalism or is linked to it, particularly groups like the IRA or UCICA in Kosovo or various other groups. What you see in that is somehow these nationalist movements arise and become violent simply because they're nationalists. Or rather, what we can say, and I say it fairly carefully, the so-called civic nations have been involved in no less conflict than ethnic nations. In fact, the United States, for all its civic peace, was engaged in more interventions and more wars than was its great counterpart of ethnic nationalism, the Germans of the 1940s. Now, that does confront, that is, we are seeing new civic nations like my own Australia enter off into wars and go off gloriously to fight for peace and humanitarian ends, which have caused as much conflict and chaos as they've solved. And the second point that can be made about this is that nationalism close to home is always called patriotism or civic nationalism. You look at it somewhere else and it looks a bit funny, and so what you call it over there is ethnic nationalism. The second one I want to mention just in passing is the explosion of irrationalism hypothesis. This is just an excuse for no explanation. When you can't understand something, it must be irrational. And so that what the argument is that when somebody carries bombs strapped to their bodies or somebody heads off to war in some way, they're obviously irrational in the way they've gone about it. The worrying thing is they actually choose to. That's actually more worrying. That we see an upheaval in the world that people are choosing to do such things is horrific. And it's true in the Islamic variant, neo-fundamentalism, in its content and rhetoric is anti-modern, but it actually is anti-modern from modernists arguing against modernism. Osama bin Laden and those sort of writers, those thinkers, talkers, those activists in the world today are modernists, and they're reclaiming neo-traditional values from a modernist position. They tended to go to universities, they did engineering degrees, and they've come back to haunt us. It's accurate that neo-fundamentalist movements have turned to violence, including the suicide and martyrdom bombings. However, that does not make irrationalism the source of violence itself. Lots of other irrationalisms like the clash of civilizations hypothesis, but I want to turn to the return of the repressed hypothesis, which also gives some sense that this new violence we're seeing in the world today is really the upwellings of what was happening in the past. So if you go to Rwanda and the genocide there, it is seen as the return of the repressed. That is, those tribal groups that have always been in each other's throats finally pick up their machetes and start slashing at each other. And this is just a return to what they were doing under conditions of pre-civilization modernity. Well, when you know those conflicts, and you know the conflicts that are occurring in the Balkans, Africa, the Middle East, or Indonesia, or East Timor today, there is no return of the repressed. What we're seeing is the ways in which tribal life has been reconstituted, traditionalism has become neo-traditionalism, and we're seeing all sorts of ethnic differences which are being revitalised under different terms. We're living, as we were talking about, as was mentioned in the first paper, we are living in a different world. The origins of the conflict can be found in modern processes of upheaval. And the last one, which is just as damaging as all the rest, is the lack of resolve hypothesis. Somehow that if we were tougher, if we bulldozed more houses, if we entered into more wars, if we somehow resolve not to fail under the Vietnam syndrome of falling away from conflicts like places in Iraq where we don't have enough troops there. If we simply showed the resolve, then we'd root out terrorism and ethnic violence wherever it occurred. And what we've seen, however, and what I'm going to argue, or what I am arguing, is our own ways of intervening in these wars have been misplaced, unhelpful, and unproductive. In fact, they have been counterproductive. They have often caused more of the problems to continue than they have resolved. So that's the first argument, that those mythologies are unhelpful, and I'm really thinking back to that idea of this being a real-world conference and a real-world series of thoughts about the consequences. Now, argument two, that there's been a fundamental shift in the dominant form of militarised violence away from interstate wars to localised transnational conflict. It's been generating and intensifying over the last, say, 2 decades, but since 1945 we've seen this shift from intrastate violence to what is misleading being called intrastate violence. And if you call it intrastate violence, if I can have an aside for a moment, if you call it intrastate violence, the effect is that it occurs just within states. It occurs just within Israel, or just within Bosnia, or just within East Timor. And once you've done that, you've missed out on the regional and globalising implications, but also the globalising consequences and implications of what has caused those particular conflicts. We go back to the UNDP report of 1994, and it states, "With the dark shadows of the Cold War receding, one can now see that many conflicts are within nations rather than between nations. For most people, the feeling of insecurity arises more from the worries about daily life than from the dread of cataclysmic world events. Will they and their families have enough to eat? Will they lose their jobs? Will they be tortured by a repressive state?" and so on. Now, the focus of that report in 1994 was on human security, and human security was developed as a counter-concept to military security, and it said that human security is as important as military security. In fact, the two very much go hand in hand. However, in that report, the phrase "within nations" started to let people off the hook. It actually said within nations this occurs. Somehow that the state, therefore, was to blame in this process. And sometimes states are to blame, and sometimes it's much broader than that. But still missed out on the way in which all these things have globalising implications. It stretches along diasporic networks, financial support paths, internet webs and armament supply chains, and that's just to name a few of the global connections that we see. Nevertheless, that report marked a shift in the way we started to think about war, and then subsequent UN reports started to look at the ways in which the nature of violence has changed. So in the early 1990s, acts of genocide occurred in Europe and Africa. More than 200,000 people were killed in 92 to 95 in acts of genocide in Europe and Africa, and something like 500 and probably close to 800,000 people were killed in Rwanda in 1994. That was not an interstate war, it was a new kind of war. It was a violence which occurred both inside that country and across its borders. Across the decade of the 1990s, we saw a large decrease in deaths from interstate violence. It was down to 200,000 people over the decade, which was down from nearly 3 times that number in the 1980s. At the same time, nearly 3.6 million people died from this new kind of transnational localised violence. 3.6 million people were dying in wars that were of the kind that people couldn't work out how to stop. The refugees and displaced persons grew by 50%, and across this period, half the civilian war casualties were children. Estimated 300,000 child soldiers worldwide. You could see things were changing. We no longer had institutionalised violence of the kind that were interstate. We had a violence which was relatively new, or at least in its magnitude, taking over the world. So what we get here is a picture of a frighteningly violent world. A world which reaches deep into the life worlds of people. And that this leads to a new kind of war. And it's what might be called hybrid wars, stretched across different domains of social life, from the civil to the global. They encounter them all. Sometimes, and this is the scary thing in literature, these wars, and I've been describing how horrific they are, these wars are called low-intensity wars, because they don't have lots of tanks. They don't have big military machines. But these low-intensity wars, I don't know, it's a bit like the term intrastate conflict or failed states, one of the most misleading of the many distorting terms in the field, also being called civil wars, which doesn't actually get at it at all either. So in the case of Rwanda, Angola, Mozambique, the Congo, the Sudan, Bosnia-Herzegovina, these wars have had higher casualty rates than most what are called high-intensity wars. Now, something is changing and something is different. These are wars of a different kind. And writers are having real trouble coming to terms with them, ignoring most of the evidence to the contrary. Kalevi-Holsti, for example, writes, if such a large proportion of the wars have domestic origins, because you can't explain it by international relations terms, then the place to pursue explanations is not in the character of the relation between states, says an international relations expert, but in the character of the states themselves. And hence, the whole of the process of a whole tradition of writers turned inward to try and re-understand what was happening. Now, my concern is to challenge that whole emphasis on the state as the basis of war or ethnicity as the basis of war, and we have to see it in much more comprehensive terms. And maybe this is the only difference between the first paper and the second paper. I think you do have to have generalising theories, although I agree they have to be able to recognise historical change, they have to recognise historical differences, and they have to recognise spatial differences across different kinds of phenomenon. The third point then, and the third argument I want to make, is to talk about the ways in which the core issues need to be understood across the local, regional, national and global. And globalisation is a very interesting concept here. In fact, our papers almost parallel each other. They move towards globalisation as the last part of the process. Because what I want to talk about is globalisation, not globalisation per se, but the particular kind of globalisation we have in the contemporary world. It's not a critique of globalisation per se, and I'll make that really clear. It's a critique of the way in which the current world is organised. And what we are seeing in the current world is an increasing unsettling of existing life worlds, an accentuation of past and present cleavages of identity politics, the intensification of communicative basis for knowing what happens in the rest of the world and then using it as propaganda or as other forms of social comparison, increasing objective divisions of wealth and the disruption of older authority structures, and huge pressures, particularly on states, huge pressures on post-colonial states in particular, as they try and cope with the immensity of change, the speeding up of change that we've seen across the last 2 or 3 decades. So from the present standpoint, and you'll see it's only one standpoint, globalisation brings with it potential cleavage. It brings with it the possibility for violence. And I'm saying it brings with that because of the ways in which globalisation is part of the process of the contemporary world in upheaval. And if we don't have a way of responding to that, and it doesn't mean counter-globalisation, it means an alternative form of ways of thinking about our relations across local, regional, national and global. If we don't find a way of thinking about alternative forms, then we're going to repeat the crisis that we have and repeat it ad infinitum. I say that this is only one perspective because there are other perspectives, and I put one forward as Thomas Friedman's Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. His theory was, and he got away from it more recently, was that any country that has McDonald's in it will not go to war with another country that has McDonald's in it. And the trouble with that grand theory of explanation of the prevention of social conflict was that just as he put it forward, the United States, as part of NATO, invaded the old Yugoslavia, which also had McDonald's in it. So it actually broke down quite significantly. But I'll just read it. He's writing here from perspective on his previous book. In the Lexis and the Olive Tree, and you'll get the Jewish references here, I argue that to the extent that the countries tied their economies and futures to global integration and trade would act as a constraint to going to war with their neighbours. The Golden Arches theory stipulated that when a country reached the level of economic development where it had a big middle class, enough to support a network of McDonald's, it became a McDonald's country. And you'll know that Israel is a McDonald's country. There are many McDonald's here, but there's also a whole literature on McDonald's in Israel, which is worth pursuing if you have the time. McDonald's countries don't fight wars anymore. They prefer to stand in line for hamburgers. Now, I don't know if you feel that completely insulting, but that's how I found it as an Australian, let alone someone who's in a war-torn zone. And this position, developed at length, replete with all those insulting characterisations of nation-states as McDonald countries, fell down almost as it was enunciated, and then it fell down again 3 times. But he replied to the critique and said he was not referring to interventions, civil wars, internal wars, or border skirmishes. Now, that actually cuts out, as I've been just arguing, cuts out most of the wars happening in the world today, given that most nation-states don't go to war with each other. The other part, he tried to develop an argument that affluent countries don't go to war. But when we look at the countries which go to war most often, we actually look at since 1945, those countries that have been to war most often, where are they? United States, Britain, Australia, Iraq. There's a number of countries there, mostly countries that are Western. When you get Iraq has been an example which is counter to the trend that I've been arguing about, but his theory becomes doubly redundant because of that problem. And then he's upgraded his theory. His latest theory is called the Dell theory of the conflict prevention, which means that if you have a computer factory in your country, you don't go to war with a country which has also got computer factories in it, which is really an argument for the integration of economies. But I don't know of any nations which have more integrated economies than Palestine, Israel. I don't know of any countries that have more integrated. If we just go back to the beginnings of the Second World War, or the First World War actually, might be an even better example. Germany and England had the most integrated economies of any economies in world history, and they went to war with each other. So, in summary, I think the argument that globalisation brings peace is simply wrong. But similarly, globalisation doesn't bring war. Globalisation of the current kind brings disruption. It brings upheaval. And unless we find ways of coping with that disruption, then we will have to find ways, unless it just finds ourselves going back across. Now, I've got a whole lot of stuff in this paper which tries to understand the nature of how explanation of the wars and the conflict we see in the present world. But I just go across that very quickly in conclusion. They requires layers of explanation. In fact, it's what I've attempted across those last couple of books, to start with specific problems and very specific histories. You cannot understand the world by doing abstract theory in and of itself. But by the same token, you need to abstract from those particular histories and particular places and times in order to make generalizing claims, as I've been making across this entire talk. So in a second step, you need to look at the ways in which we're seeing changing modes of practice in the world today, from production, communication, inquiry, organisation, and the ways in which these things bear back upon the nature of how we live our lives, our identities, and the wars that we start. We need to even move more abstractly again to what I would have talked about as ontological contradictions if I'd had time to elaborate on it. And what I mean by that is that what we're seeing in the world today is an increase in embodied violence, an increase in the ways in which we are reasserting embodied forms of identity. They're seeing the reassertion of ethnicity. Embodied violence means that if we looked at the ways in which wars are fought, the movement was from 10% of people killed in wars were civilians at the turn of the century, that is the turn of the 19th century into the First World War, 50% by the Second World War, and 90% in the subsequent period of the wars that I've been describing. Now, we're seeing, therefore, embodied globalisation through refugees and the movement of actual people on the ground and the pain they feel in their bodies accentuated. But that's occurring within a much more abstract society, within a world which is abstracted by communications and economic relations, which see themselves leaving behind those primordial, irrational, mystical things of the past. And it's in that tension and that contradiction, to use Motti's terms, the contradiction between different forms in the world today, that we find most of those tension arising. We see a new kind of ontological insecurity. And in that ontological insecurity, and what I mean by ontological is basic, foundational, going to the heart of being, we're seeing a twofold process. First is raised expectations and the collapse of routine as a replacement of traditional forms of security, on the one hand, so we're seeing intensified modernisation, and on the other hand, we're seeing an intensification of its opposite. The prior verities of identity formation, like nation and ethnicity, have come back, and they've come back in new forms. In the end, to return to the conversation at the start that I made, we need to also look at ourselves, because what we're seeing in the world today in response to the chaos and the violence and the crises that I've been talking about, violence which is killing millions of civilians around the world, and as part of a change which has seen us face a world of a new kind, people are caught between perhaps three ways of being. There's a kind of foreboding. There is a jouissance that sees itself manifested in the nightclubs of Tel Aviv and the cafes of Melbourne and the excitements of the beaches on California. And those foreboding jouissance doesn't carry through into a politics. What it leads into, for the most part, is a kind of lassitude, a feeling we can't do much about it, it's bigger than us, it's too big and it's beyond us. And this lassitude means that we withdraw into these moments of foreboding and joy about the world, and we leave the space to others, we pass on that space to others. And this is the space, I think, in that states do their worst. In conclusion, I think we need to re-engage people in a politics of reconciliation and social renewal, but this will entail a long and slow revolution. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul, very much for a talk which started with a call to historicize and in many ways demystify certain terms, re-ethnicity, re-violence, re-the state, which we are using all the time, and ended quite movingly, I thought, with a call for a passage from discussion to politics, in a way, I thought. Now, both talkers who continued each other called for a deconstruction of sort of terms which repeat themselves in the discussion of nationalism, good or bad, Western and Eastern, European, non-European, rational, non-rational, etc. And both called for a multi-level dealing with various problems at the level of the local or the communal, at the level of the national and the state, and at the level of the multinational or global. Now the floor is now open for your comments and queries and questions. Please. Someone would have to start.
Okay,
yeah.
I'm obliged to. I think we've had two excellent presentations, very stimulating. Paul James's paper has thrown me back to my original interest in ethnicity and the state in Africa. And I want to reinforce what you have said about the causes of so-called ethnic violence in Africa, which is devastating this poor continent. It is true, it's not ethnicity as a primordial identity which caused it. It was the project of nation building, and the nation that they set out to build at independence was a civic nation. And this was the terrible project which has caused much of devastation of Africa. And the second force that has caused devastation in Africa, you are right, is globalization. Because globalization destroyed African economies and pulled the rug of even a minimal social security under the feet of the Africans. And the poor Africans found themselves in a totally collapsed state and collapsed world. And return to ethnicity, which was always there, was not the cause, but it was the refuge of poor people who wanted to make sense of the world in which they are living and wanted to mobilize the social resources that were available to them in order to assert themselves. But unfortunately, it came too late, and this identity, rather than being constructive in the collapsed world in which they lived, turned to be destructive, enhancing the destruction that has already been there. So I think ethnicity, in a sense, or the causes of ethnic violence in Africa, and I suppose in other third world countries, is that ethnicity at the beginning was delegitimized and demonized, rather than being legitimized and seen as a natural phenomena, thus using its constructive potential rather than destructive one. And maybe this has been my view, which I expressed in the early 1990s, that perhaps the only way to rehabilitate Africa is to give ethnicity its natural and legitimate place in African society, because it's not a manipulated identity, it's the identity of ordinary people.
Many things you said were important, but one of them was social collapse in general. So that the claim at the moment is that we're seeing failed states in those places, and there's the cause of violence, along with a return to primordial ethnicities as somehow coming up from the past. And in the Sudan, in Eritrea, and in Rwanda, that was clearly not the case. In fact, particularly in Rwanda, it wasn't a failed state. It was a state which was an overreactive modernist state. And when the genocide started in Rwanda in 1994, it was French-trained modernist youth movements, the Interahamwe, who were connected to the state, who, because the state became very powerful, had organised a whole series of groups, and they began the process of the genocide very systematically, in a modern way, very rationally, with machine guns and strategic targets around Kigali. And they shot so many people in those first few days that they had to get garbage trucks to collect them. That is, they used modern techniques and systems, including garbage collection, to make sure that they didn't find too much mayhem in the streets, particularly bacteria and disease arising out of dead bodies lining the streets. But the other aspect of what you said was that, and I think I certainly agree with the way in which ethnicity became delegitimized, but it was not just delegitimized, it became also, in the case of Rwanda, to use that as an example again, it became codified. So it took the identity of people and traditional identities, which were much more open with boundary movements between them, and I think particularly to use the Rwanda example again, where they brought in ID cards to try and cope with ruling, and the Germans and then the Belgians ruled with very few people in that country in the turn of the century, and they did so because they had identity cards, and they did it by a kind of indirect rule, and they fixed in place two identities which were not actually so separate, the Hutu and the Tutsi, which were actually part of a similar clan relationship to each other, where there was a movement by Kwihutura between the two groups, which allowed someone who was Hutu, a subordinate, to become a Tutsi, a ruler, a person who ruled the landscape. So, in effect, it's such a complicated history, and this is where I think history takes us to understanding how we've got to the present. To give ethnicity back would have to take it back to allowing people to reflexively understand the course of their history, to rework and to remake their identities, rather than just give them back Tutsi and Hutu, because Tutsi and Hutu were already rationalized identities which have perverted earlier forms of ethnic difference.
Yes, who is down?
Okay, thanks very much. Paul, enjoyed your comments generally, but I have a question. I fully understand and agree with your point about this myth of ethnic violence, in other words, ethnicity as a source of conflict. And for me, it was most visible. I mean, it was visible throughout the collapse of East European communism, Soviet communism. Commentators were looking for something simple to explain very complex phenomena. And this was most clear to me in the case of Albania, where during the collapse of the pyramid schemes in '97, where commentators were looking, well, what's the Gegen Tosk formula here. You know, is this the basis of this conflict, North against South? What I don't understand, though, is when you start talking about, or when you mention the fact that you don't think the state is the basis for violence. I mean, I think that surely that depends. I mean, I don't think you can be as general about it as I would say you can about ethnicity, which is a little bit more complex. And for me, the best example is Yugoslavia. I mean, granted, there were many factors involved in the breakup, decentralization, aspiration of different nations, or different nations reforming states, if you like. But I don't think there's very much doubt in all the evidence that I've looked at for 15 years that there was one primary source of militarized violence, but also one primary source of fostering those ethnic divisions as the pretext, in a way, for the violence. In other words, yes, the powers that were in Belgrade.
Yes, no, I agree with what you've said entirely, and I've obviously expressed it badly because I'm thinking about the ways in which it's expressed within the mainstream that the state is the source of the violence. And it's expressed as the collapse of states give rise to the primordial expressions of upwellings, and that gives rise to the violence. And that I actually much more attuned to what you're saying. I agree entirely with that view. That is, and you take the case that I know much better of the former Yugoslavia and say Kosovo, when Milosevic went down to Pristina and to the Bay of the Plain of the Blackbirds and gave that speech, he rediscovered a kind of national connection, which meant that at the point when 3, 4, 5 years later you get a new nationalist uprising, he's able to carry forward those speeches of earlier. And when the threats by Bill Clinton are pushed against him with the idea that we will invade and take Kosovo and we will invade your country, all you have to withdraw from is Kosovo, he could not, because his whole state power depended upon staying there. And the effect of him, however you think about him, he was a manipulative politician. He may not have been in charge of genocide, he may not have known or had much control over what was happening in Srebrenica and those sorts of places. However, he used, through the state, the kinds of chaos that ensued, and he made possible all sorts of things that were happening on the ground, and used that to ends that meant that when we got to the next stage and Madeleine Albright said we have to go in on the basis of the Ratchak massacre, there was no chance that they could do otherwise. They'd actually misunderstood, and there was no chance that he could withdraw either. If you think about the state in a number of other places, like East Timor, where they're talking about a failed state, it's not the failed state, and in fact it's more, as Motti was saying, it's a failure of a comprehensive sense where he's seeing fragile economies, fragile communities and fragile states contributing. In this particular instance, the state is part of the violence as well, because what happens is the sacking of half the military, particularly when half the military are old Faluntil fighters who didn't get pensions after a 25-year war and find themselves on the beach on a $2 a day selling fish with no sense of the future. They respond by thinking we will take over the state. So the fight for the state and the fight of the state is also part of the violence. And there's perhaps a third way in which the state gets involved in violence. That is through what is called too easily humanitarian intervention, where we don't do enough work on what the intervention should do. I'm in favour of humanitarian intervention, by the way, but I'm against bombing from 3 kilometres, having misapprehended and misunderstood the place completely, and then deciding that bombing can make a difference in and of itself. And usually what happens, you can have a threat of awe and horror on a place. You can take over a place, you can win a war in 3 days, but winning the peace takes, as we know, another 10 years and perhaps a couple of generations.
Could you pass
I would try to go back to what both speakers said and which I share, in fact, and which is the fact that we have to discard common and easy dichotomies when we look at nationalism. And precisely the dichotomy between ethnic and civic nationalism, or contractual organic nationalism, or cultural political nationalism, and so on. We know a lot of scholars who worked using this kind of dichotomies. I think they are not very useful in order to understand how nationalism in fact works practically on the ground. However, and as it is the first session, I think it's important to stress one thing at the start. Even if we cannot, I think we cannot completely do away with another theoretical framework. And precisely on one point. And the point is that we have to distinguish between theories looking at nationhood and theory of nationalism. And indeed, it's not the same thing. When I say nationhood, I mean by that the sense of belonging to a country, the awareness of being member of a national community, of being French, German, American, which is very often called patriotism, in fact. But from a theoretical point of view, it raises all questions looking at nation building. All theories on nation building are, in fact, theories of nationhood. So how you become a French, German, and so on. And I think this question of nationhood is a little bit different from nationalism per se, because nationalism is fundamentally an ideology to begin with. Without people, without intellectuals who are framing the national idea of a people, there is no nationalism to begin with. And from that point of view, I think that Keduri was completely right to stress the importance of ideas. And when you look historically at more or less all national movement, you see that the intelligentsia is absolutely crucial. Without intelligentsia, you have no nationalism. So I think that nationalism as an ideology is important, and then, of course, also as a political movement. Because if you want to have a nationalism which is working, you have to have, after the intellectuals, after the intelligentsia, you have to have people who are using these ideas in order to go in political action, and which mobilize people and try to convince them that they are a nation, even in fact they have no sense of being that nation. Because this is of course typical, some of you are historians. In the 19th century, a lot of people had no sense of being part of being a nation. But 20, 30, 50 years after, suddenly, not suddenly in fact, but they were aware of being a nation. And why? Because you had all this work which was done by the ideologists, and after by the practitioners of politics. So I think this, for me at least, this is something which we have to keep in mind. There is a distinction, nevertheless, between nationhood on one sense and nationalism per se on the other hand, even if, of course, there are links between two, but we cannot completely discard this distinction. Thanks.
Just very briefly, I agree completely there is a difference between nationhood and nationalism. I think I would define it a little bit differently. Nationhood is, as you said, it's a stating of a fact. It's the belonging to a nation. The state of being a nation is nationhood. Now, nationalism is, like all the isms, is everything that comes out of it, which can be an ideology, as it was thought to be previously, and which I think it is no longer, but it's still the cluster of conclusions that individuals and groups draw from being a nation. And that is, if nationalism means that you, if your country is at war, you'll fight for it. If your culture is being threatened, you'll speak up for it. It's the it's what you do as a result. Nationalism is it's the active side of nationhood, of the fact of being a nation. Now, what I tried to say in my lecture was that there is no doubt that in the 19th century, nationalism was developed by philosophers, by thinkers, as an ideology. I mean, these people said, if all of us become nationalists, if each one of us holds their nation sacred and important and so forth, and the whole world will be divided into nations, all free, and therefore then it'll be a better world. In that sense, it was an ideology. It was a way of transforming the world into a better place. What I'm saying now is that it has dwindled. It has become thinner. It still exists. I mean, there are times you are tested, and then your nationalism becomes active in some sort of way. But it's no longer an ideology for most modern people. This was my thesis. It is different than just belonging, but at the same time, it's no longer this highfalutin idea of that it was.
Yeah, I will have to be quick because I have to catch a train to Beersheba. But just very, I'll be back tomorrow. On the point of ideology, of course, if you come from a Marxist tradition, you know, all ideologies are self-serving. Therefore, they're all non-ideologies, really. You seem to think, Professor Ben Israel, that there is some kind of purist ideology that is beyond and outside the interests and the material existence of people. And just following from your last comment, I'm not sure that I share that. But I want to congratulate both of you for wonderful opening lectures, and I want to make a couple of comments on them. First of all, Professor Ben Israel, you talked about culture and power as the common denominator, the minimalist line of nationalism today. And I wonder whether you left out by accident or by purpose the issue of space. And I think that is exactly how culture and power are brought together through the domination of space, or control of space, or the manipulation of space, that it completes at least a common denominator of nationalism. And in that respect, I want to take issue with the general narrative that you presented, that nationalism becomes thinner, less ideological, and more sort of pragmatic and daily kind of existence. And I want to position it vis-a-vis the situation of space. I think that if you go to Iraq today, to Venezuela, to East Timor, to Kashmir, to Tamil lands, to Palestine, etc., you find that nationalism is just as hot under the collar as you think it's no longer. And therefore, I would like to think, like you suggested, that there is not one framework, but maybe a mezzo kind of approach that you can collect various cases that have similarities, and where the control of particular groups that have nationhoods, that feel themselves as a community for whatever reason, how old or new, their control over their space is threatened or violated, then you find nationalism of the type that you think is disappearing.
Well, thank you. I did leave out space, and it's there. I mean, the territory comes in, of course. I don't think it's as dominating in most places as it used to be, but you're right to put it in. But I want to comment on something that you said, which I think is very important. I've just come out of 6 months in our Institute of Advanced Studies, where I was a member of a group on religion and nationalism. And I purposely didn't refer to it here because I would never have finished if I'd brought religion in. But one of the theses that was forming in my mind through these 6 months of discussions of religion and nationalism is that today, and I think that would fit the list that you mentioned, where nationalism is still violent and all-absorbing and very emotional and not at all like the thin nationalism that I described, is in places where religion comes in. It sort of provides the fire for it. It lights it up. That I think, and therefore I think that today we had long discussions in that group on how active religion is in the formation and in the action of national movements. And I think that one of the conclusions that I reached was that it did come in, sometimes genuinely, and sometimes it was used strategically in order to get at the emotions of people. Religion was used in order to make, in order to sublimate nationalism and make it into a stronger force, because religion, after all, has proved its power to move people. So nationalism used it. But today, I think these two forces have split apart. You can identify nationalisms where religion does not come in, where nationalism which has become civil, which has become secular, and which leaves religion out. And on the other hand, you have these strong movements that you have listed, and I think, I don't know everything I should know about each one of them, but I think these are cases in which religion flares up.
I welcome the opportunity to respond to that question, Oren, because of the seriousness of it in relation to the present. Because for me, actually, religion is part of the same process. So religion doesn't enter into it for me as a means of understanding how nationalism becomes intensified. I actually think both religion and nationalism have become intensified by what we were describing earlier as an intensifying contradiction between embodied and more abstract processes of social relations. And in the case of East Timor, religion is actually irrelevant to the ways in which the war is being fought there. And in the other cases, we can go through and show how religion has not changed the way in which the violence is being caused. In a way, one of the things, and I'm just using as a motif of that same argument, globalization is seen as abstract and deterritorializing in terms of its spatial configurations. And yet, what we've seen rather than the abstract deterritorialization of globalization is that at one level it does. At the level of the symbolic movement of abstract culture and capital, then we've seen deterritorialized movements of power and relations of exchange. But once you get onto the ground of how people live in places, they are attached to the ground strongly, if not more strongly, than they ever have been. And if I say if not more strongly, I don't mean that the passion is more intense. I mean they're more reflexive about it. They now know how to talk about it through the language of anthropologists and political scientists, because we have taught them how that means to think about the relationship to space. So space, for me, is very central to this. Yep. Yep, that's right, yep.
Right, now we have 4 more people lining up for questions here. Moti has already allowed 10 extra minutes, and we'll go on for a little bit, right? I think you were first. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I have a question for Paul about the globalization. You talked about globalization, but you didn't establish any global form of violence as such. Well, you didn't talk about the global war on terror, and of course the terror as a global sort of global violence. But in this connection, don't you think, or cannot this be that that globalization itself can be viewed as some sort of low intensity or maybe invisible violence itself, and to that various other forms of terrorist violence, they are induced by this situation which is created by globalism. If we read the UNDP global reports, then you see that with every year the gap between the rich countries and poorer countries is growing. And I think that globalism has something to do with that. And of course people, maybe not very consciously, but they must feel, if they are living in a poor region of the world, that this is something is not very good and something should be done. And if they don't know the better forms, they might resort to some sort of violence. Thank you.
In terms of global wars, I think the first global war was actually the Second World War, and it was during the Second World War, or shortly after, in 1947, that the First World War was named as a global war. But in fact, for the most part, it was fought in the European theatre, and the Second World War actually drew the whole world into it. And I think it's probably unusual, but I agree with George Bush for the first time that we're actually engaged in the Third World War, and I therefore agree with you that the war on terror is a globalizing war, and it's drawn nations from across the world and countries, regions, places, peoples into a war which, in a funny sort of way, is partly symbolic and in other ways is very structural. So including Ariel Sharon would talk about this being a war on terror, and people in Russia would talk about the war on terror in relation to Chechnya. So what you get is the war on terror gets generalized in much the same way as the Second World War did and spreads by a whole series of processes. Now, in relation to your second point, which I think is a very important one, which is about the structural violence of globalization, I absolutely agree with you with one proviso. As long as we're talking about the contemporary dominant form of globalization, not globalization in and for itself per se. Globalization, to use the terms before, can be defined, and it's pretty simple. Globalization is the extension across world space of social relations, where world space is defined in terms of the historical period in which we're living. Now, I think globalization, therefore, can be seen in the Roman Empire and its extensions across the world space that it lived in, and it saw itself as connected into places as far afield as China and so on. And there were, in that process of globalization, certainly therefore carried by empire, and we've both been talking about how important empire was to globalization, were structural violence built into it. The kind that means there were inequities and surplus value was expropriated from places. What we're seeing in the present, as you say, is an increasing division of wealth and poverty, but it doesn't, and this is not to dispute what you're saying, it's just to put one little caveat in. When we look at terrorism around the world, most terrorists are not poor people. Most terrorists are actually intellectually trained, to go back to an earlier comment about the importance of intellectual training, intellectually trained modernists who are looking for an alternative source of meaning and go back to neo-traditional values as a way of doing so. And they use the book. They use the book of the Quran or whatever it happens to be, the Bible in some cases, to go back to be terrorists. And as they go back, they see no other way out. And one of the grievances they draw upon is exactly the one that you have described, a generalized sense that the world is an unequal place.
Right, we have 5 or 6 more minutes, and we shall try to squeeze the other 3 questions and answers into
Marx was also not proletarian, right?
He was also Jewish too. Fits into your list, doesn't he? Marx, Karl Marx.
Let me be very short then. The argument that there are many conflicts, inner conflicts, or intrastate conflicts, which are not ethnic, but they are only conceptualized as ethnics. How can we, because every conflict of this sort is multifaceted, multidimensional, and so forth. But the fact that a conflict is multidimensional, it doesn't rule it out to be ethnic or national. The question is, what is the prime factor? What is the character of the conflict? How is it conceptualized in the minds of people, and so forth? So how then do you distinguish between ethnic and non-ethnic in this way? I mean, that becomes really a conceptual question. So many of these conflicts, from my point of view, they are ethnic. Let's take Chechnya. I mean, it's not an ethnic conflict. It's about nationalism. It's about secession, and so forth. Or Rwanda. I mean, we have a genocide between people who are different in ethnicity. I mean, it's hard to say. Of course, there are other factors. I mean, that's, I take it for granted. Any such phenomena will be complex and has many factors and so forth. But then we have to decide when we call it ethnically based and when we don't ethnically based. And let me just one more point. I mean, there is this project, the MIR project, about minorities in the world and the conflicts in the world and so forth. How you relate to it? It's just, they are just misconceptualizing all kinds of ethnic conflicts.
Thank you. I would hate to be thought of as actually against the word ethnicity or nation or tribe. I actually think those terms are really useful, and that tribes are fighting each other, ethnic groups are fighting each other, nations are fighting each other. So in the same way that we were both talking about using terms very carefully, I've got no problem with saying that the conflict is between two ethnic groups. My concern is with the ways in which, and I don't doubt that you don't do that, the ways in which the characterization of something as ethnic violence starts to name the thing as its totalizing way of describing it. Now, for area studies specialists who know the complexity of places, there is no issue. They can do that quite comfortably. But for theorists, and there's a whole lot of them who use the term ethnic violence as a kind of generic throwaway description of the situation at hand, when they say ethnic violence, this is ethnic violence, or this is a civil war, they give the impression that it's contained within the state. And from all the examples that I can think of, there is not a single example which is contained within the one little nation state without spilling over its boundaries, without diaspora communities contributing to it, without flows of capital, without movements of armaments, without borders being crossed by all sorts of issues of military, economic, social and other political pressures. So I've got no problem with what you're saying. I have a problem with those who take it one step further and say, because we're describing this as ethnic violence, the cause of it is ethnicity. It's that step I'm arguing against.
Right. You had a question, I think. I'll take this. Where is this one? Okay.
Well, my comment went in the same direction, and I suppose the same answer may apply. I think we have to be careful about denying that there's ethnic conflict in the world and that ethnicity is a motive. I was traveling with the Bosnian Army in 1995 when I asked its commander, why do you keep on referring to your enemy as the Serb Chetnik enemy? Because after all, I was well educated and knew that this wasn't necessarily at its base an ethnic war. And he had a great reply. He said that's what they call themselves. And this is extremely important. They identified themselves as Serbs, an ethnicity if you like, a religion if you like, but something quite clearly. And they identified themselves as Chetniks, which meant from a particular historical background, not communists, but people who had been anti-communists. And I think it's extremely important not to not deny the reality of ethnic conflict. And I wanted to register a vote for Oren as well. I think ethnic conflict takes on particularly pernicious forms when it's attached not to space, as he said, but to territory. Space is a general term. I'm a very pragmatic person. It's territory that brings violent conflict in out of ethnic conflict. And it's territory for obvious reasons, because two people can't occupy it at the same time, and because one of the tenets of most ethnic nationalists is that I can't live in a minority in your country if you can live in a minority in my country. I will not accept being on your territory. You're going to have to be on my territory. And that's a formula for war. So I just don't want to get too far from reality. Globalization, fine. All sorts of levels of interpretation, fine. But when you get down to the actual fighting, a lot of people think of this as an ethnic war. It's not something imposed from the outside.
By bringing in territory, you have really shown that it isn't just ethnicity that causes it.
It's not just ethnicity. It's ethnicity and the denial of equal rights to others on the basis of ethnicity. And that's ethnic war. And when it's attached to territory, it gets really nasty, as you know very, very well.
If I can just respond in the terms that you've said it, sure. I think you're three-quarters wrong. Firstly, groups live in fragile enmity and concern for each other, if you can hold both those things together, and have their architecture intertwining in the same street. It suggests that the territory that you're talking about is fought over under very specific historical conditions, because going back to the 14th and 15th and 17th centuries as these different churches were built, they were part of the same territory and they were interlocking with each other. You go to Jerusalem and you try and walk those streets and you say they fought wars over territory simply because it was, and you'll find yourself facing four quarters where they're able to hold that in fragile difference for a long period of time.
Denying the reality of ethnic warfare. I know the history of Sarajevo. I've walked all of those streets. I've walked the streets of Jerusalem. I know the history of Jerusalem. It's ethnic nationalism attached to territorial claims that creates those periods of war.
No, creates those periods of war. I would argue it would take us a whole history of working our way through Bosnia or Jerusalem to actually talk about that. It is the disruption of the ways in which the organisational forms of relationship to territory and identity occurs at certain periods of history that causes particular conflict. In prior periods, there's a book by Tone Pringa called Being Muslim, The Bosnian Way. She describes villages which were territorially mixed.
You're arguing against me when you raise Tone Pringa.
Yeah.
You're not arguing against me.
Okay.
You're arguing in favour of me. Because Tone Pringa's whole point is that was disrupted by ethnic territoriality.
You're using ethnic territoriality to describe particular disruptive process which disrupts earlier forms of ethnic territoriality. In fact, you're using...
I'm going to disrupt you now. I'm going over there, pass on the mic to Alon, and then Erica will make her comment, and we are done.
I'll try to be short, also because I'm the chairperson of the next session, and I'd like you to stay here. I don't think that there is necessarily a contradiction between the two views. You both ask different research questions, and you are looking for different answers. Now, as Paul James shown, I think, ethnicity is not always the reason for local conflicts, in spite of what scholars or other people tell us, in spite of what they tell us that it goes back hundreds of years, etc., etc. And this can be shown, and this is a specific theoretical point, similarly to saying, and agreed by some, if not most scholars these days, that nationalism is recent. Fine, it is recent. But from the subjective experience of people, and here I come to your thing, from the subjective experience of people, Jewish nationalism may be recent. If you go out now in the street or in this room and you ask most Jews who live in this country, they don't think that their nationalism is recent at all. They think it goes back to time immemorial almost. So in the subjective experience of people, ethnicity and nationhood become factors, values that are important in explaining us, scholars, in explaining their motivations, their willingness to die and to kill. So ethnicity may be recent, but still, it works in the real world in the sense that people embraced it